In 1954, Packard Motor Car was really starting to experience some financial struggles. And it's unfortunate because Packard really had so much that it was going to introduce for the 1955 and 1956 model years, but it really just was too late. In 1954, Packard still had a straight 8 engine. In 1954, it'd actually be the largest that it would ever be, and it would be the largest straight 8 engine ever put in an American car, 359 cubic inches. And it even had an aluminum head. Yes, I said that right. An aluminum head on a flat head engine. By the way, Packard did end up having some challenges with that aluminum head warping. So it wasn't all that great or reliable compared to the cast iron straight 8-cylinder engines that Packard had been producing for many years prior to that. And in 1954, the styling was also getting a little tired. Nobody could say that this particular 1954 Packard, while certainly a handsome car, was anything that was a style leader. Now, Packard did have quite the team in the 1950s. John DeLorean actually got his start at Packard before leaving for General Motors. And Dick Teague was a chief designer at Packard before he would go on to American Motors Corporation. So he had quite a few automotive luminaries who started their career there. And there were, of course, others too. But in 1955, Packard would introduce the last of one of the really true Packard vehicles before it would end up merging with Studebaker and then sharing some chassis with Studebaker for what was called the Packard-Baker series of vehicles. The 1955 and 6 Packards really are technological marvels in a number of respects. And I just want to talk about a couple of the instances of the pretty awesome engineering in these cars. First of all, under hood, Packard finally released its first overhead valve V8 engine in 1955. And while the engine was being developed, it was thought that smaller displacement was really going to be the way to go initially. However, once Packard saw that a number of automakers were increasing the displacements of the engines in their vehicles, they decided to build an engine that could have the potential to be expanded up to 500 cubic inches with 5-inch bore centers, basically the same as the Cadillac big block, the 472 and the 500, as well as the 425 and 368 that would be offered starting in 1968. So Packard had devised its V8 engine to be able to scale up to that 500 cubic inches from the get-go, although it never got there. It started out at 320 cubic inches in the lower-end Clipper line, and then it was 352 cubic inches in, I'll call it the senior Packard line. Then for 1956, Packard made the largest V8 that it ever would, 374 cubic inches, which would be the standard in the senior Packard line. The Clippers would get the 352 cubic inch V8. All Packard V8s were topped with 4-barrel carburetors or dual 4-barrel carburetors. In the case, as an example of this particular dual 4-barrel 374 cubic inch engine under hood in a Packard Caribbean that made 310 horsepower and had a 10-to-1 compression ratio. This was some pretty serious power for the time, to be honest. And it's too bad because it just came too late for Packard. Another little interesting tidbit is that Packard would end up selling some of its V8s to American Motors for use in Nash's and Hudson's. But in 1955, they would sell the 320 cubic inch engine from the Clipper to Nash and Hudson. And they detuned it slightly, I think to 208 horsepower, down from around 220 to 225. And Nash and Hudson, I think once they found this out, complained, and Packard decided to give them the full horsepower. I thought that was pretty humorous that they would sell their V8, but they would detune it slightly so that it wasn't quite as powerful as their own lineup. I'm sure that did wonders for the Packard-AMC relationship just about the time when they were looking for some cash. Now, the other amazing thing about Packards of the era was that they had what was called a torsion level ride. The ride was supported not by coil springs, but 4 torsion bars, 2 of which were about 9 feet long. If you look at number 2 in this photo, you'll see this black bar that runs from the front control arm, the lower control arm, all the way back, partway down the body, and that was the main torsion bar, as it's appropriately labeled here. There was obviously another one on the other side. And then there's a compensator torsion bar, number 3, that you can see in this picture. It's shorter, and there was one of these on either side as well. So many cars during this era had 4 coil springs, or they had leaf springs in the back, coil springs up front, but very few, I think if any, in the US had 4 torsion bars. And the cool thing about this, why it was called torsion level ride, was that not only were the torsion bars effectively serving as the springs in the car, which was somewhat unique and helped with cornering, because torsion bars instantaneously can basically exert resistance once they start getting twisted. They're effectively like an uncoiled coil spring. Whereas a coil spring, you tend to have to take up a little bit of the slack first before it starts exerting its resistance. Here you didn't have that, but Packard was able to have these torsion bars create kind of a, I want to call it a mushy ride. It wasn't really mushy, but it was a nice, soft, supple, and yet, somewhat controlled ride as well. But in order to do that and offer this type of a ride, that meant that putting weight in the car, like a significant amount of passengers or cargo, would really create a bunch of sag in the rear, because the torsion bars really didn't have all that much resistance, torsional resistance, relative to what they would have had without this type of a system. So in order to compensate for that, Packard employed what looks like effectively a starter motor to effectively crank those compensating torsion bars to level out the rear of the car in the event that it started to sag or that it sat too high, to keep the rear end level. Now, this motor, this electric motor, would only activate after about 6 or 7 seconds. It would sense that the car had a different ride height in the rear than what was desired, and then it would activate and crank the rear up or down by turning those compensating torsion bars. This is not an active suspension setup that was effectively making adjustments while you ride. As I mentioned, it would have a delay of 6 to 7 seconds before it did anything. The objective here was to enable Packard to use relatively soft torsion bars with relatively little resistance to give a nice soft ride, but then compensate for the fact that there was a soft ride and the issues that that would create by having these compensating torsion bars, as I mentioned, with the electric motor. And here's what this electric motor looks like, that kind of big black cylinder. It looks like a big starter motor, and I think that's kind of what it was. And we'll see in a second what it would crank on to kind of turn the torsion bars to level the ride in the back. But, what a cool invention. Again, this is the mid-1950s. This is, not the 80s, 90s, or later. Packard was really ahead of its time. And in this photo, you can see the torsion bar that's kind of connected to this arm that moves by that electric motor. And that's what cranks up the rear or lowers it based on the ride height. A pretty ingenious system. Obviously do the same on the other side as well, so that these would operate in tandem and that you would have the same level on either side of the car. What a cool engineering solution. And I'm sure it was not a cheap solution at that. Now let's take a look inside this particular Packard, and you notice that on the brake pedal it says Easomatic Power Brakes. Well, you're going to say, power brakes, many cars had that for 1955, at least as an option, and it was optional on Packards as well. You could get standard non-power assisted brakes. But this is one of the engineering follies of the 1955 and 6 Packards that I think was just a terrible, terrible design. And what do I mean by that? You say, power brakes, how can that be a terrible design? Well, nothing associated with the power brake and how it works, but the location of the componentry is far, far suboptimal. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look under hood again, and you see pretty standard under hood engine bay. This one does have the optional oil filter and the oil bath air cleaner, which the Packard V8s had. A generator, you can see the heater box there on the firewall, of course the battery. But do you notice something missing from the firewall? Where's the master cylinder? Where is the power brake booster? Oh, well, Packard decided to put those in a very, very interesting spot on these particular cars, one that makes the servicing, let's just say, not all that fun. So how do you service the master cylinder on these? How do you add fluid to them? Well, just wait. The first thing to note is that this ease-o-matic power brake pedal is actually connected to a plunger on the backside of the brake pedal. Yes, I said that right. There is actually a plunger on the backside of the brake pedal. And why is that? Because the master cylinder and the brake booster is underneath the floorboard. Yes, that is where it is located. It's underneath the floorboard behind the brake pedal. What a crazy, crazy spot to locate these components. So in order to change the master cylinder, you have to, as you can see in this photo, pull back on the accelerator pedal. It's just on a ball stud. You can see the ball stud there. Remove the carpet, and then doing so gives you access to an access panel behind the carpet. And you have to remove a series of screws to get the assembly out. Here, by the way, is the back side of the brake pedal. You notice it's connected directly to that rod that activates the master cylinder, and it's held in place by a cotter pin that you remove. So that's how you get that out of the way in order to remove the access plate and get to the master cylinder. And if you want to try to get it from the top, you really have to move quite a bit as well. You're going to have to take it out through that access plate, to my knowledge, in any case. But you can see, take a look at the arrow here. This is where you would add the fluid and remove the cap for the master cylinder. I have no idea how you would add fluid to this car kind of in a normal circumstance or get that cap off. You can see that the opening is obscured by the steering shaft here on these power brake cars. I just cannot believe that this is how Packard decided to engineer this. I mean, if you had a leaking wheel cylinder or something, or you lost some brake fluid, trying to add fluid alone, forget about the fact that it's tough to change out the master cylinder and the brake booster. These, by the way, are Bendix systems on these Packards. I mean, that's hard enough to kind of change the master cylinder and the power brake booster, but just to add fluid, there's not a dipstick or a tube or anything that you can easily add the fluid. I guess you have to either remove the access panel to add fluid, or you try to snake a line down from the top, and I don't even think you can do that. So if somebody knows how to add brake fluid to your Packard quite easily, let me know. But to my knowledge, you can't. You basically have to take off that access panel and try to get fluid in through there, or try to get it from the top, which is not easy. In this photo, again, there's been a lot of componentry that's been removed to get it out of the way so that you can see the master cylinder and the cover. And here's what a rebuilt Bendix treadle vac system looks like. You can see that little area there where you add the fluid to these setups. I just have no idea why Packard would locate it there and make it so hard to add just brake fluid. It's just crazy to me. For all the engineering that they did, that was really the best that they could do with the brake system, and that to me just seems crazy. So again, if anybody's got an idea of how you easily add brake fluid to your 1955 or 6 Packard with power brakes, please let me know and put a comment in the comment section, because I do not know how to do that. And there you have just a few of the engineering oddities of the last of the Packards, the 1955 and 6 variants, before Packard would really just be relegated to, well, I guess a division of Studebaker and not really producing much in the way of cars. Unfortunately, the very last Packard to bear the Mark's name was this 1958 Packard Hawk. Didn't even have a Packard V8 under hood. It had a Studebaker-sourced V8. And by this point, the company had merged in 1953, and I guess Studebaker just felt that it didn't have the money and the capital to continue with the Packard brand. This was the last hurrah, effectively just redoing a Studebaker Golden Hawk and making it the Packard Hawk with this interesting duckbill kind of front end, an unfitting end to a really storied mark in automotive history. So what do you think of these engineering innovations, or quirks, I guess? Put a comment in the comment section, let me know. Thanks again for watching.